Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is a show where we want you to consider and then we consider what you know of the news of the day. So let me begin with a recap of the news that happened today. It's quite a day. It began with the stunningly direct rebuke by the palace over the handling of the emergency ordinances. The palace said that the Agong was deeply disappointed. Amat duka cita, as His Majesty had never consented to the revocation of the ordinances and instead wanted it discussed in Parliament. Dewan Rakyat then erupted following the Agong's intervention, but today's session was put on hold several times before being adjourned till Monday. Now, in response to the palace's statement, Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin's office defended his decision, claiming that all action that was taken is legal and according to the federal constitution. So tonight on the show, three analysts will be joining us to help us make sense of this tumultuous day in Malaysian democracy. First up is Tricia Yeoh. She's the CEO of the think tank Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, or better known as IDEAS. Tricia, good evening. Now, when it comes to the handling of the emergency ordinances, I mean, we've got both the palace and Putrajaya claiming to be upholding the constitution, but then we have both sides arriving to very different conclusions. Would it be fair, Tricia, to say that at this point in time that we are in a constitutional crisis?
Hi, Melissa. Hi, Sharaad. Thanks for having me again. Yes, I do believe today, well, there have been many instances this year where we thought that there would be a constitutional crisis, and today that this has come true. So just to reflect again, what is the crisis? So the crisis surrounds the revocation of the emergency ordinances, right? So as you rightly recapped earlier, the Agong, through the statement that was released at about 12 this afternoon, expressed anger. So I think duka cita actually is the polite way of saying anger in palace terms. Expressed anger at these two individuals, the Law Minister and the Attorney General, for misleading Parliament, stating that the request to revoke the emergency ordinances were done hastily without tabling to Parliament, and that whatever statement the Law Minister gave conflicted with and confused Parliament and does not respect the rule of law. So what we understand thus far from the timeline of events, trying to piece together the timeline of events based on this statement, as well as the following statement that was issued later on in the day, in the evening, by the Prime Minister's office, which makes us understand that on the 24th of July, the YDPA, the Agong, called for a meeting with these two individuals. And according to the palace statement, the Agong had requested that these ordinances are to be tabled and debated in Parliament. So it sort of leaves us to understand that the two individuals did nothing and, in fact, assumed that this was an act of revocation already. So what you see
Tricia,
that's right.
Yeah, so Tricia, there's one thing that's interesting about the PM statement is that they also underscore the relationship that Cabinet and Putrajaya has to the palace, essentially saying that the palace must act on the advice of Cabinet. Did you find this particularly striking in that the tone seems to be one of instructing or reminding the palace of its constitutional role?
Yeah, so I think this is the crux of it. Can the Cabinet advise something which the Agong does not agree with, and just leave it at that? Or in other words, does the Constitution allow for the Agong to always have to act on the advice of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet? So what the second statement by the Prime Minister's office is saying is that they only needed to stop at that step. They did not therefore need to go beyond that. What they're saying is, okay, the Agong must act on the advice of the Prime Minister. However, the Constitution does not actually provide for a time frame for between the rendering of advice and the Agong acting upon it. So in that sense, we should not presume that the Agong has acted or is required to act the moment the advice has been rendered. In fact, my understanding of the Constitution, and I'm not a lawyer here, but my understanding is that the Agong is entitled to request for information, to discuss, get advice, to obtain documents, and to provide his views in order for the government to consider those views before the Agong actually acts on the advice. So I think there seems to be a missing step here. It's almost as if, okay, they did seek that meeting. So in fact, there were two meetings from what we understand between so the first meeting was between the two individuals, as mentioned earlier, with the Agong, and then again on the 27th of July at 12 p.m. This is in accordance to the Prime Minister's office statement. Yeah, the Prime Minister and the AG met with the Agong and again gave this advice that the cabinet has advised the revocation and so on. But nowhere has it said that the Agong actually agreed to what the advice of the cabinet had been. So I think there are some missing gaps here, and the two statements that we're deriving this information from are not filling in all of the gaps. And I think there are still a lot of things that we don't know.
So it feels like we're at an impasse at the moment. Tricia, what do you think needs to happen to break this impasse? Can Parliament play a role? I know we've adjourned for the week, but there's one more day of the 5-day sitting on Monday. What is likely to break this impasse?
I doubt that Parliament will be able to do anything at this stage because ultimately a lot of what transpires in Parliament rests in the hands of the Speaker. So even if there is any motion by any member of Parliament for a vote of confidence or no confidence for that matter in the current Prime Minister, in the current government, I highly doubt that the Speaker will acquiesce to those demands because this has happened in the previous parliamentary sitting and his justification for it was that government business of the day comes first. Although I don't think this justification would work now because this is a special parliamentary sitting specifically to lay before the House the emergency proclamation and supposedly the ordinances.
Right.
What can
Tricia, I want to ask you, very quick question, Tricia. Sorry to interrupt. If Putrajaya had taken a much more conciliatory tone in response to the palace statement today, could we have had a parliamentary session in which the ordinances were laid before the House and we had at least some chance to see the House debate it before we actually saw the end of the emergency? Because once, as I understand, once August 1st comes around, all these questions might be moot.
Yeah, so I was actually surprised by the very harsh and aggressive manner in which the Prime Minister's office statement was worded and that response was done. And I don't even know what the strategic thinking is behind this because as you say, by 1st of August, which is not very long from now, all this would have been a moot point anyway. So I'm also trying to determine the strategic reasoning behind this. One of the possibilities I'm thinking of is that if they had not decided to revoke these emergency ordinances on the 21st, there is a possibility that some members of the House would have wanted to either, number one, amend, or number two, revoke certain portions of the emergency ordinances. And this current government does not want there to be any slightest opportunity for there to be a vote in the House. That is the only reason that I can think of right now to have done the revocation at such hasty speed on the 21st.
All right. Tricia, thank you for sharing your insights with us. That was Tricia Yeoh of the think tank Ideas. We're going to take a quick break, but back with more in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
Control, self-lockdown itu penting. Lebih kurang pergerakan, maka lebih sukar untuk COVID menjangkit kita.
Untuk tempoh 2 minggu ni duduk di rumah. Kalau kita boleh laksanakan PKP kendiri dan keluarga.
Saya kira insyaAllah kita boleh berjaya. Akhirnya kita menang.
Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. We're discussing the extraordinary events of the day, everything from the rare and direct royal rebuke over the conduct of the current administration to Parliament being interrupted and subverted, and finally a lengthy denial from the executive over the legality of the way the emergency ordinances were revoked. Let's ask Ibrahim Suffian of the Merdeka Centre what he makes of this all. Ben, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, there seems to be a standoff between Putrajaya and the palace after the Prime Minister's PDF, which seemed to explain away the concerns and the rebuke by the Agong. Are we at an impasse here, Ben? Is there anything likely to change this dynamic?
Well, I think first and foremost, thanks for having me on. If you look at Malaysian politics, hardly a moment passes without something surprising or unexpected turning out. And we are, nearing the weekend, so Parliament session is not meeting tomorrow. And we have 3 days with which so many things can take place. And so I think, if we look at the lengthy statement coming from the Prime Minister today, that reiterating that he has acted within the confines of the law and that he has spelled out the steps that were taken before the announcement by Law Minister Taqiyuddin in Parliament on Monday, he seems to be digging his heels and staying on, not basically taking the royal reprimand, directly, and instead standing his ground and stating his case. So I think in many ways, we are looking for a certain kind of, I hesitate to say the word confrontation, but I think there certainly will be a contest of wills between that of the Prime Minister and the government bench against the statement that has come out from the King and that of the opposition and perhaps other dissenters within his own ranks in the coming days. We potentially have one more day of session coming up, so I expect to see some fireworks.
Ibrahim, do you think that, UMNO, that's played a very key role in supporting the current administration, looks like on one hand it's rallying behind Muhyiddin, but on the other hand there are calls for him to leave, but not for his government to fall. UMNO seems to be sending out mixed messages about what it wants to see happen as a consequence of today's events.
Well, if you look at the different statements coming from the senior leaders of UMNO today, it's very clear that the party is very factionalized between Ismail Sabri, who's Deputy Prime Minister and also Government Whip, and that of Zahid Hamidi, who's President, and the social media statements by former Prime Minister Najib Razak. So I think in the coming days, we are going to see these two internal factions of UMNO contest and persuade UMNO members of Parliament to take a stand, perhaps on Monday, on whether they stand with the Prime Minister or they stand on the side of the palace, I think, in this instance. So we are going to see perhaps a kind of realignment if the persuasion powers of the UMNO president and the leadership of the party is stronger than that of those who are currently in the incumbent government. We didn't manage to see this thing transpire today, partly because the session was cut short for the COVID tests that these members of Parliament had to take on in the later part of the afternoon. So I suppose we will see a continuation of this contest take place on Monday. And I think at that point, we will see whether all the UMNO MPs are going to sit on the government bench, or some of them are going to request a seat elsewhere, indicating withdrawal of support. I think that would be the only way that they can manifest itself, short of manifest their support or lack of support, short of being able to vote on either bills or motions to be tabled.
Can I ask you, Ben, then what the role of the Speaker might be in shaping the proceedings on Monday?
I think the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker has, I think, played a role in giving priority to the government agenda. So I think there will be a lot of pressure on the Speaker to allow for a motion to debate and discuss the emergency ordinance, the statement from the palace, as well as the action of the revocation and the other motion. I mean, we understand that the opposition leader has filed a motion of no confidence. I think all of that is going to be debated, or I suppose heckled, on Monday. And we will see that transpire, I hope, on live streaming.
Ibrahim, all these stakeholders look to the Malay ground, to their primary constituent, the Malay society, for their legitimacy. Today, we have this very strange situation of a government that claims the mantle of, a Malay Muslim government, at the same time in conflict with the Malay rulers. And the word dahaka, central to kind of Malay political discourse. How does that all pan out? I mean, can they continue to look like they are against the palace while claiming to hold up the mantle of the Malay agenda?
Well, I think if you look at the Malaysian political system, any administrator, any prime minister will have to rest on two sources of support. He has to get the support of the people, manifested in the majority support of the parliamentarians in the House, and he also has to have the confidence of the monarch. And I think in this current situation, you have an administration that has been severely criticized, for many, many things. We do know that with the high number of COVID cases, there is an impact, a negative impact in the confidence in the administration right now. So it looks a bit weak in that area, particularly in the public space, because not just the infections, we also have economic problems. At the same time, in recent months, we do know that the Malay rulers have met. They have expressed that they do not wish to see the emergency continue. They expressed concern over the COVID cases and the economic impact that it has had on the livelihoods of the Malaysian public. So it gives a sense that on these two fundamental grounds, the administration is on shaky legs. So this is a problem. So for a leader like Prime Minister Muhyiddin to take on the palace at this point in time, it is somewhat going to be an uphill situation, going to be challenging, largely because his own party and coalition is not entirely solid with him. In the beginning, we also have very fuzzy indications whether he has a majority or not. At the same time, we also know that his coalition members are not all together with him. So some of people are, wanting to leave. So it is a bad time to contest one's position with the palace. Typically, the palace wins in the hearts and minds of the Malay public.
Thank you so much. That was Ibrahim Suffian of the Merdeka Center. We're going to take another quick break. More in just a few minutes. We'll be right back.
Self-lockdown tu penting. Lebih kurang pergerakan, maka lebih sukar untuk COVID menjangkit kita.
Untuk tempoh 2 minggu ni, duduk di rumah. Kalau kita boleh laksanakan KKP, Kendiri dan keluarga,
saya kira insyaAllah kita boleh berjaya. Akhirnya kita menang.
Amanah di tangan kita. Adat.
Hi, thanks so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Political scientist Dr. Wong Huat joins us now to discuss the events of this extraordinary day. Huat, thank you so much for joining us. Yesterday, Bangi MP Ong Kian Ming called for a COVID-19 moratorium agreement of sorts in the spirit of bipartisanship. And I'm just wondering, Huat, after the events of today, do you think that bipartisanship will be even less likely?
Yes. Thank you for having me, Melisa and Sharaad. It's going to be tougher because the government legitimacy has been eroded more than before. The constitutional crisis we are looking at has two parts. One is that the law minister and the government have misled the parliament. The second part is about the government assertion that the king must act according to its advices. And so the second part is about the confrontation between the palace and the government. But the first part is whether this government can stay in parliament. So this is what's going to affect the bipartisanship here. It is not completely ruled out, but it's going to be much more challenging.
An interesting statement that was made by the Deputy Prime Minister, Ismail Sabri, who is from UMNO, claims that the government of the day, the Perikatan National Government, has 110 or more, I believe is how the expression, members in the House supporting it. The insistence on that they have the majority is an interesting one, considering that that is much contested. You've talked a lot about whether majorities are needed to govern. What do you make of this insistence on UMNO and Perikatan's majority versus what a rival might or might not have?
Now, the government claimed to have 115 seats if UMNO stays with the government. That means all you need is 6 UMNO MP to change their allegiance and the government become a minority. If the government is really so confident that it enjoys a simple majority, then it should have taken on votes over the revocations, the annulment of the emergency ordinances, because that would be construed as a victory. So for me, the Deputy Prime Minister's statement is just very much an assertion. Unfortunately, it carries no credibility, and it will be tested in September because there will be a royal address. At the end of the royal address, it will be a vote. And if the government loses that vote, that is not a rejection of the royal, the palace. Rather, it would be a rejection of the government. So it would amount to a vote of no confidence.
Huat, I'm thinking about how the events of today, the developments of today, will impact the crises that we are dealing with. I mean, right now we've got a constitutional crisis, but we've had to battle a public health crisis and an economic crisis. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on how COVID-19 pandemic management might be impacted by the events of today and likely ensuing events.
Yes, certainly it would be, because if this crisis prolongs, no one knows how long the government would last. And therefore, you would have a lot of ministers paying attention to their political career rather than in managing the pandemic or the economy. So it goes back to one question, whether the government wants to find a settlement or whether it wants to continue to be defiant to both the palace and the opposition. The choice here is that the government needs to decide whether they want to make any sacrifices over the fiasco in the parliament on Monday when the minister has misled the House. It's two different things that the cabinet has made a decision on last Wednesday to revoke the ordinances. And another thing that the cabinet decision has been given the royal consent and gazetted. So in all meaning and purposes that the government has misled the parliament, the choice is whether you're going to see one or two officers a minister sacrificed, or that you want to prolong the whole thing until in the hope that the government will win completely, which I think this would be bad for the country. The government's best choice is to seek consultations with not just the palace, but also the opposition, so that the royal speech would then represent a reconciliation package for the country to focus its energies in fighting for life and livelihood.
Chin Huat, I mean, so I get your suggestion or advice to the government and how best to proceed, even in its own interest, but it seems to not follow that. I mean, if it's a short-term interest that it's thinking about, the question is, what would incentivize this government to take a conciliatory approach, to try and find a middle ground? I mean, is that just naive thinking on the part of people who would like to see better governance at this point in time?
I think society would need to send that message clear enough to people in government, and create the expectations on the royal address, because the government can avoid they can avoid making any move in this 5-day sitting, but they're going to pay the price in September. So that's really a choice that I think the government can make to put itself in a safer position. The royal address can be a point of solution, but they probably would need to do something on Monday. That is to put the 6 ordinances to be annulled by the parliament, so that will be part of the concession. The other part would be what kind of responsibility that the government want to undertake for misleading the parliament.
Right. Okay. But Chin Huat, I understand. Is reading the Prime Minister's office statement, it gets a clear sense that they believe the revocation is a done deal. And there's also this other issue, which is that, you know, an annulment would have had to happen before the end of the emergency, not after. Monday would represent, a period after the emergency. So are we facing a kind of legal conundrum? I mean, can Parliament snatch this this impasse and this crisis from the jaws of what seems to be inevitability of us having the ordinances continue for the next 6 months?
I disagree that Monday is too late for the annulment of the ordinances. The reason that this is the last day of the 5-day sitting, and in any case, after it gets passed in the lower house, it needs to go to the Senate. So the government definitely will. By allowing it to be now, the government would solve that the subject matter in the confrontations with the palace. That paved way for it to focus on pandemic, and the government should see that with the rise of vaccinations, the government may be able to find a solution. It should really think a little bit more long term than just acting defiantly.
Thank you so much, Chin Huat, for joining us tonight. That was political scientist Wong Chin Huat wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.